All right, we are in Amos chapter 1 this morning, continuing our look at Amos. Probably good if I go right side up. I'm going to be a little more ambitious today and try to take more than one verse. Last week, of course, we were able to talk a little bit about the opening salvo of the message that Amos has been entrusted to take to the people of Israel. And we see the poetic use of voice here. It's interesting, again, you have here the opening in 1:1, the words of Amos, and then he is very careful in the message that he's delivering. The theme opens with the voice of Yahweh, the voice of God roaring out of the citadels, underscoring that this is a message entrusted to him. Conspicuously, the roaring like a lion, the withering of the pastures, Amos as the shepherd, these things sort of tie together. And then the idea that this theme here that he's setting out in verse 1 is very much the idea that the voice of the Lord, the voice of judgment and condemnation, is coming from inside the borders. It's coming from inside the citadel, from your security, your safety, your stronghold. The judgment coming upon you is from inside. This withering of the prosperity that we see with the shepherd's pasture grounds and the summit of Carmel. I'm going to read, I have gone and done a little bit of a translation. I don't think it's going to be terribly different, but there are a few choices made here that we'll discuss as we go forward. But I'm going to read effectively from 1:1 through 2:4-ish. Probably stop at 2:3. The words of Amos, who was among the herdsmen of Tekoa, who saw visions concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. And he said, Yahweh from Zion roars, and from Jerusalem he gives voice. Then mourns the shepherd's meadows, and the peak of Carmel withers. Thus says Yahweh, for 3 transgressions of Damascus, and for 4, I will not turn it back. For their threshing of Gilead with implements of iron, and I will set fire to the house of Hazael, and it shall consume the citadels of Ben-Hadad. I will break the bolt of Damascus and cut off dwellers from Avon Vale, and from him who holds the scepter of Beth-Aden. And the peoples of Aram shall go captive to Kir, says Yahweh. Thus says Yahweh, for 3 transgressions of Gaza, and for 4, I will not turn it back. For they're inflicting a total exile to deliver up to Edom, and I will set fire to Gaza's wall, and it shall consume her citadels. And I will cut off dwellers from Ashdod, and him who holds the scepter from Ashkelon. Then I will turn my hand against Ekron, and the Philistines' remnant shall perish, says Lord Yahweh. Thus says Yahweh, for 3 trespasses of Tyre, and for 4, I will not turn it back. For they're inflicting a total exile, delivering wholesale to Edom, and they did not recall the covenant of brotherhood. And I will set fire to Tyre's wall, and it shall consume her citadels. Thus says Yahweh, for 3 transgressions of Edom, and for 4, I will not turn it back. For pursuing his brothers with the sword, and stifling his compassion, his anger tore continually, and he kept up his wrath unending. I will set a fire in Taman, and it shall consume the citadels of Basra. Thus says Yahweh, for 3 trespasses of the Ammonites, and for 4, I will not turn it back. For they're splitting open the pregnant women of Gilead so as to expand their borders. And I will light a fire on the wall of Rabbah, and it shall consume her citadels, with war cries on the day of battle, and with a tempest on the day of the whirlwind. And their king shall go into exile, he and his princes together, says Yahweh. Thus says Yahweh, for 3 trespasses of Moab, and for 4, I will not turn it back. And for his burning the bones of Edom's king into lime, And I will set fire to Moab, and it shall consume the citadels of Kirioth, and Moab shall die in an uproar, in shouts and in the sound of the sound of the ram's horn. And I will cut off the judge from her midst, and all her princes I will slay with him, says Yahweh. From there, he's going to pick up with Judah and then on to Israel, but I'm going to stop there with the judgment on the nations. Sorry, I got distracted by my own note there in 2:2, the sound of ram's horn. If you guys are familiar, of course, with the shofar, it's literally, that's the word. It's with the sound of the shofar. I distracted myself with a footnote. I apologize. So, the judgment on the nations. The prophecy from the words of Amos, or the mouth of Amos. He begins with Damascus, or perhaps better known as Syria. And this is not intended to be a geography quiz by any means, but Syria, of course, is going to be sort of here-ish in relation to Israel at this time. Gaza is the second one that's called out here, and Gaza at the time was effectively the capital of Philistia. And I don't know if I'm going to peg it exactly correctly on the map, but it's sort of on this end of things, isn't it?
Across from the Dead Sea, but Philistia.
Sort of over here.
No, on the west, on the Mediterranean.
Oh, sorry.
But across from the Dead Sea,
So here.
further north. Yeah.
I was about to say, Gaza's further north than that, isn't it? Thought it was on the upper end of. So as we follow these around, then Tyre, of course, Tyre and Sidon show up in a lot of prophecies, and the Lord, in his own voice, will condemn Israel with them later. I don't know why I capitalized that one. The Phoenicians. That's not right. Is it?
P-H-O-E.
I was about to say, it goes in with the, it's not quite as bad as Pharaoh, but. It's going to be kind of up on this end of things. Back north, somewhere in this range. Edom. Edom, of course, being those descendants of Esau. They don't really need their own, but and then Edom, if I recall correctly, is on this side, right? Sort of over here.
Down south of the Dead Sea, between the fork of the Red Sea.
Down here.
Yeah, the
Or
range
Moab is here.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
You got it.
So I should probably label these, huh? What does we say?
Sorry, I didn't know you wanted labels.
No, I'm going to label them so that I don't forget which one was which. What did I just say? Edom.
That's right.
Next, we come to the Ammonites. And then finally, he's going to get to Moab. However, there is also a oracle that we have not yet read against Judah. And then finally, he's going to turn to Israel itself. Moab over here.
That's Ammon. If you write Ammon right there, you're good.
Is Moab north or south of them? I forget.
That's all right. Just right on. Moab is south. Just sitting there bordering right on the Dead Sea, east side of the Dead Sea. Yep. That's Moab. You go ahead.
I wrote Edom again. It's because I'm thinking about cheese. No. Can't even talking right. Wow, what a mess. Okay. That over with. Hopefully we'll get ourselves back on track now. It's interesting, however, that we pick this up, and we've briefly discussed this in the sort of preliminaries, but the words of Amos, which he saw visions concerning Israel, and then we launch into this judgment against the nations. It's not until down here that we're actually getting to Israel. So what's going on with this? A number of the commentators suggest that this is some kind of bait and switch, that Amos is telling the people what they want to hear before he hits them with the judgment. I don't think that's it at all. I don't think that it's not a clever rhetorical device. I think there's actually a number of things that we can pull out of the judgments on the nations. It is a multifold communication that God is putting in here. First of which is God's sovereignty over the nations, not just his chosen people. That God's vision and his intention and his purposes stretch over the whole earth. You can see this, again, not to reach outside too much, but just in terms of talking about prophets, there are obvious references to this in Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. This will be stated very explicitly, God's sovereignty over these nations. You, of course, have the famous moment in Habakkuk in which God is describing how he's going to use one of these nations as an implement, and Habakkuk objects, basically saying, you're too pure to even look upon evil. How can you take this evil nation in your own hands as an implement? And God doesn't rebuke him for that comment so much as to reiterate all lands are mine, all things are tools in my hands, everything is at my disposal. I am sovereign over all of these. It may be worth mentioning here, Amos does not offer an oracle against Egypt. He doesn't mention anything about the Assyrians or nothing sort of future-looking. Surprised me a little bit how many of the commentators wanted to talk about Babylon, given that the actual Babylonian exile is not until about 150 years after Amos, and Babylon as such would not even really be nascent for another 70, 80, almost 100 years. If anything, the Assyrians were kicking around, but not particularly strong at the time. So Babylon kind of occupies a lot of space in people's heads, but the actual Babylonian, or Neo-Babylonians, I should say, that we think of as the Babylonian exile is not coming until significantly after Amos's specific message.
I think that's a very important point, but I don't know exactly what it means. These are petty states in the ancient world. This is more like a neighborhood squabble, where you have a subdivision where nobody gets along.
No.
But none of the Hittites, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, none of them are mentioned at all. It's all just this
Well,
neighborhood.
I do have a thought in that regard, because one of the things that's happening here is, again, some of the commentators that I'm reading are trying to pull out hermeneutical principles out of this and mention, that it sort of has to do with the prophet's messages have to do with the things, the context in their own day. That's largely true, but one of the things that's happening right now, and we talked about this when we talked about the history, Israel and Judah are effectively the big player in the area at this moment. When Amos is out there, they are the biggest power in the area at the time. Egypt is in decline. Neo-Babylonia isn't even really there. Assyria is effectively in a lull. Israel's kind of the big dog in the neighborhood at the moment. Now, they have fights. We will see in the specific condemnations. They are at war with these things, but at this specific moment, this is a period in which they had actually expanded the borders almost back to Solomon's day, almost back to the full Davidic range. So effectively, Israel is kind of the major influencer at the moment. So one of the things that we're going to see as we go down here is that doesn't actually help Israel in these condemnations. We'll get there. But Egypt is in decline, Assyria isn't really doing much at the moment, and Neo-Babylonia isn't really there yet. So we're about 150 years or so ahead of the Babylonian exile, depending on which decade you want to peg Amos's ministry to. one of the reasons I asked to do this, and I apologize, Aaron, that I had you put this up for this reason alone, but one of the questions that comes up a lot is, why are they in this order? Why are we doing the nations this way? And there were a number of suggested solutions, some of them more convoluted than others, none of which I found particularly satisfactory. There's not a particular chronological order to the judgments that are given. These don't correspond in a chronological order to things that were happening in Israel's history as far as I can read. William Hendrickson seems to agree with me there. Some have tried to make sort of a spiral out of it, but if you follow them in order, that doesn't even really work either, because you go 1, 2, 3, all the way back down though, 4, so now we're not spiraling, 5, and then 6. Maybe it's because I spent hours and hours yesterday working on the brakes on my truck, and I took all of the tires off and put them back on. But the thing that occurred to me was I was taught when you put a tire back on, and mine had 5, okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You don't do them in a circle. You're supposed to go across. You go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? And that to me feels like what we're doing here. We're tightening the screws on the machine. We are going around in such a way that this judgment's not going to move. We're securing the wheel around Israel here.
Well, this is not nearly as prosaic as that, I admit. But for the most part, if you draw a line, if you connect the dots, just about every line
runs through, right. And that is the more accurate, perhaps, is the suggestion that it's kind of a crisscross. It's not quite, but effectively you are running through Israel's territory.
It also says that Yahweh roars from Zion, which would be Jerusalem, so it's almost like it's radiating.
I do think that's partly it. The other thing that occurred to me in this sense, and maybe you guys don't watch terrible superhero movies like I have, but you know those scenes where everything is falling apart and the camera is panning around our heroes as a thing explodes over here and over here and over here. It's almost cinematic the way that Amos is panning around Israel saying, here's a judgment, here's a judgment, here's a judgment, the destruction is all around you. And that's the significant thing is, as we come back to it, these are the borders. This is all around. And the other thing that occurred to me in this that I didn't see so much in the commentators, but there is also an element of we're told in the final judgment in the Lord's return that he will come like a thief in the night. There is an element of almost unpredictability to the order of these, in the sense that God is not going clockwise or chronologically in the beef that they have with Israel. He's coming upon them as the Lord brings up the indictments. It's his timing, his order, his intention. Significantly, though, these judgments, this rendering of judgment to the nations, is not delivered to the nations. It's delivered to Israel. Amos was sent to preach to Israel, and he has now come into Israel preaching about these nations. He didn't go to Moab, he didn't go to Gaza and preach there. Jonah was sent to Nineveh, of course, probably in a similar time period, but he's delivering the message to Israel. These prophecies against the nations, I think, have 2 elements here. One of which is there's a prophecy against the nations, lest by the time we get to Israel, they claim to be singled out, that the Lord is being unfair to Israel and condemning them for things that all the nations are getting away with. All of my siblings are doing these things and God's not punishing them. Well, you don't get to say that because he's gone down the list. But he doesn't stop the list with all of the nations. He comes to Israel, lest Israel says, we are chosen. We have the favor of Yahweh. We get away with these things because we're the special people. And all the nations, all those heathens around us, well, they get punished. Ariel.
Maybe this is not the time, but wonder if you would juxtapose that against the passage in the New Testament that says if judgment starts with the house of God, how much harder will it be on the unbeliever? And I wonder if there's any thought there.
There is, and I think we're going to get there. One of the things that's happening here is Amos does bring the message from the Lord in this order that narrows in on Israel. It's almost the inverse of this, which is to say, all of these nations around you are being punished for, and we're going to read in their specific indictments, they're being punished for assaulting, destroying, and in some cases effectively trying to perpetrate genocide against the people of God. So are you, Israel. You, Israel, are doing the same things that the nations are doing to your own people. It's that element of the special relationship with God makes it worse on you, not better.
Hey. It's interesting to me to see that these places of interest are today places of interest.
Yes.
It's basically the same location that everything was going on in the Middle East today is happening in Damascus.
Sure.
And Lebanon, and they've changed the names a little bit. Gaza is of Gaza today, and Jordan is the Moab of today.
Yeah.
And all these things are happening still today. That's the one point. The second point, I think, I was going to ask a question.
Yes.
When it says 3 generations, or 3 transgressions and 4,
Mm-hmm.
how much time do you think that is? How much time it took for these,
Sure.
you know,
Yeah, I appreciate your point about today. Chuck mentioned on Thursday night the extreme misuse that is unfortunately very common about prophecy. And I thought, boy, if I wanted to be that way, we could get into Gaza. Oh boy, if you look at the news at all, we could go down the road of Gaza and setting the walls on fire and all that. We're not going to do that, obviously, because we're talking about this in the context. Now, there is an element of, frankly, I think this area is always going to be a mess, in part because of the history that we're currently looking at. I think it comes down all the way down, that enmity between Israel and the nations. As much as you should not conflate secular Israel of today with God's people that he picked out here, the history that built up there, I don't think is ever going to alleviate that. Does that make sense? In terms of the 3 transgressions and 4, I'll come to that in a minute. Let me finish this thought and then we'll talk about the transgressions, because the time frame is an interesting question. So it is against both the nations and Israel. And these nations raged against Israel. God says, I will punish you for raging against Israel, but also I will punish you, Israel, for destroying God's people. You, Israel, are at fault in the exact same vein.
I find it interesting that in several cases the sins were not necessarily against Israel. They were against others of the neighbors.
There are fights against each other, and there's a couple of interesting things happening with Edom and the fact that unspecified exiles are being offered up to Edom. It's not clear who's being taken captive in those verses.
Well, that's the prophecy against Gaza, right? That they're offering up to Edom.
I was about to say, and Tyre, yeah.
That they were Israelites, so that it wouldn't make sense. It would be more Judahites down south like that. I think even today, you mentioned what's going on today. We look at that, and of course, on the college campuses, there's this homogenous group called Palestinians,
Right,
which is absolutely not homogenous at all.
right.
It's no more homogenous today than it was 2,000 years ago, 3,000 or 2,500, when this took place. They're all tribal Arabic
Right.
Bedouin
Yeah.
peoples.
And we've only got 8 listed here. There's probably 24 or more now that you could pull out easily. That's a good point. So we will try to get into the specific indictments as we go down, because it is fair, and part of what I want to do as we go forward in the indictments is to bring out not just why these specific things, but what does it tell us? So one of the questions we've talked about is, as we read the prophets, why do we care now? We don't live in 8th century Israel. Does it particularly matter in the history of this person did that against that person? One of the things that we're going to see here is, as God indicts them for things, it tells us something about the nature of, A, what he finds offensive, and B, what he will and won't permit in terms of the nations and the people. Somebody had a hand up. You and then Ariel.
I think you've made the point before that Amos's main idea here is the way you treat one another.
Mm-hmm.
And it struck me that the common thread, whatever the particular incidents are among the nations, is that it's speaking of international incidents or intertribal incidents, whereas you get down to Judah and Israel, and he's talking about what they do within their own borders.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, not to conflate any particular one of the oracles against the nations as a whole, but they forgot the covenant of brotherhood. One of the commentators, I think, made a mistake there, trying to say, well, Esau was brother of Jacob. Well, that's not who was being talked about. That's not the one against Edom. That's the one against Tyre, I think. So we'll deal with some of those as we go. Ariel, you had your hand up.
Exactly what I was going to ask, because thank you, Aaron, for in your lessons we learned that the Israelites were told, don't bother Edom, don't walk on Moab's land.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask, what about Ammon, Damascus? I mean, we know Tyre was Phoenician, so
Yeah.
not a familial tie to
Right.
Israel. Gaza, the Philistines, also they were to be driven out and destroyed. So is there a tenuous connection to the Lord through basically all the way back to Abraham's time? Yes, in some of those, but what about the others? And yet, why are they all listed?
Right. So, and then the other question that I have over to the side here that hopefully we get to today is, there is a sense in which a lot of the indictments are sort of, you either tried to wipe out or you carried off a group of people from your neighbor. Effectively, a form of genocide is the contention. And yet, when you look at the conquest of the Promised Land, the Lord specifically tells Israel to go in and wipe a certain group of people out in a couple of instances. Says, go in there and take them all out. And one of the things that causes a thorn in the side of Israel well into David's day is you didn't finish the job. You did not actually remove all the people you were supposed to remove. So there is a question mark of well, why is it okay when God tells Israel to do it? And why is it not okay when Ammon decides that he wants to carry off a bunch of, Phoenicians, for example? So as we go, I want to get into that, but I'm going to try to follow our thread here before I lose all of this, and I'm going to come back to Abe's question also of the sort of time frame. The other piece I want to pick out while we've got the map up here, though, and Chuck pointed this out, I think it was last week, this is effectively the bordering of Israel, right? That's not exactly accurate to the time, but roughly speaking, these are all the borders on Israel. These are all the neighbors that are touching their border. James, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was wondering, it says in the condemnation of Tyre, the brotherhood, they've forgotten the covenant of brotherhood. Is that the kind of relationship that Solomon cultivated with them?
Yes, so it does go back to the history there of the relationship there, and there is a certain amount of international diplomacy, right, of him having a good relationship with them, but now we're effectively at war or fighting. You had your hand up? Oh, okay. So yes, there is certainly history in the history of Israel, and I don't know that we're going to get all of it out today. But as we talk about this, the significance of it, again, to return to this point, Israel is effectively the big dog in the neighborhood. It's expanded its borders out to almost the Solomonic extent. It's the current strongest player, probably, if not the wealthiest, among the wealthiest of the nations at this time. They have actually had a resurgence, effectively a renaissance. Their businesses are doing well. And Tyre apparently kind of almost always did well, I guess being really good at sailing, you were a great merchant, but I didn't look up the comparative wealth, but Israel's definitely up there at the time. They are on their ascendancy. They are doing well in terms of military power, in terms of border, in terms of monetary wealth and influence. They're effectively on top. And Amos is bringing this word from the Lord against them, saying, I've got an issue with how you all are treating each other, and it's going to hone in on first Judah and then Israel. you should be using the power, the influence, the wealth that you have better than you are. There is a way that God wants you to treat the people around you. There is a way that God wants you to witness. I mean, we are several hundred years into Israel's history now as the people of God, called to be different among the nations. And what you're going to find as he gets into their indictments is you're not treating people any differently than the nations. You've got the wealth, you've got the power, you've got the ability to do what I asked you to do, and you are doing the opposite. Did you have your...
Yeah, I did. I wonder, from your outline and what you just said, I was thinking about this, whether or not Judah should go ahead and be added. I mean, not only would that give you 7 nations.
I did waffle on whether I would bring up Judah today or not, but I probably should have read the next couple of verses. It's really 4 and 5, and I'll go ahead and read them out of the New American Standard here, because I think you're right. Israel, obviously, the message from Amos is aimed at Israel, and Judah, while it is the southern kingdom and there is a relationship of as the people of God, it is almost treated in the same way. And yes, it's very nice to get to 7, numerologically here. So I'm going to read verses 4 and 5. It says, Thus says Yahweh, for 3 transgressions of Judah, and for 4 I will not revoke it, or I will not turn it back. Because they rejected the law of Yahweh, and have not kept his statutes, their lies have also led them astray, those after which their fathers walked. So I will send fire upon Judah, and I will consume the citadels of Jerusalem. Which brings us to this point, which is there is a template, effectively, that we're going to see used consistently in the message here. And I don't mean it flippantly. I don't think God does form letters. But you do see, effectively, the refrain here that comes up over and over again, which is, Thus says Yahweh. It does read, I think, as a list of indictments. It is almost a poetic setting of legal terminology. Again, we talked about the sort of format that the oracles of the prophets often take, including indictment, description, instruction. We are very much in the indictment here of here's what the Lord is bringing against you or against your account. That's actually it. It will consume and their strongholds. So, the format is effectively, Thus says Yahweh, for 3 transgressions of, fill in the nation, and for 4, I will not turn it back because of, and then he describes or indicts the particular sin, I will send a fire upon that nation.
I'm sorry, I know you're trying to
Yeah.
get interrupted all the time.
No, it's great. I love the questions.
But it just seems to me that the 3 transgressions and the 4th, then he always lists because, and he lists that a particular transgression.
Yes.
It's almost like that's the 4th one.
I think that's
The
it.
one that broke the camel's back. I mean, you did this, this, and this. This one here is probably the worst.
So,
I don't know that. I'm just
no, I appreciate that because that is where we're going with this, which is to say the 3 transgressions and for 4 is, if you think back to what Aaron taught us out of Deuteronomy and that sort of description or recap that Moses gives a little bit of the moving around and how we're not supposed to interact with this person and we're not supposed to interact with that person, but you also have the element of, as it's later given to Joshua, when you go into the land and you do these things, you're actually told in the conquest why we're doing this. Why are these people being stripped out of the land? This is the promised land. It was promised to Israel. It was promised, rather, to Abraham and then carries on down through. But the Lord doesn't just say, sorry, your tenancy is over. You have to vacate. The landlord says you got to get out. He's condemning the people there as too evil to remain on the land. So when he sends Israel in, he says they have filled up the measure. You're thinking of like, one of those Nalgene water bottles that you carry around. They took it all the way up to the top and let it overflow. Their sins have reached the max and gone over. And there is an element in, and not to get too deep into the weeds here, but the 3 and the 4, there is a form of Hebraism to it, which is to say 3 is the number of completion. Not to be super numerological about things, it just is. That's a consistent use of it in the text. The 3 is complete. And what he's saying is you finished. You got 3, and then you added another one. And I do think as he's bringing out a specific indictment, that one is the 4th. But there is also some people like to say, oh, great, you can add the 3 and the 4 and get 7. It's you were at the top and you went over. And one of the things we're going to get at here, and I think it actually comes out oops, I've erased it. I think there's a significant contrast and unfortunately it's going to be next week, when we talk about the indictment against Edom. What does he specifically call Edom about? That they were always mad about being Esau's descendants, effectively. That they were always in a rage. God is saying, I, the Holy One, have endured 3 transgressions. I have been patient with you through 3 terrible things that you have done. And that wasn't enough for you. You went and tried me with another one. I can't hold back. That's what we're getting at is to answer your previous question, I don't have a specific time frame. I do think that it's not over the entire hundreds of years. I want to say it was probably within the last century of their time frame. But God is saying, this is the moment. This is the time. You have gone beyond. You have exceeded. Sorry, James first, and then I'll come back to you.
So you're saying basically 3 genocides or captivity
Right.
journeys, and you added 1 more.
Right. So what we're getting at is God has said, I have been patient. I have been forbearing with you, and you've just trampled. You've effectively taken it for granted. You've trampled over God's loving kindness, His patience with you.
I was thinking it was an indication, perhaps, how long it took God to punish Israel, sending them to captivity. I've heard the number of 400 years or so. Is that kind of time frame? I mean, it seems like God was patient with Israel, Judah, for 400 something years. I don't know if my number is correct. Before He sends them to Babylon as an exile. And I'm wondering, is that the kind of time frame you can think of as 3 transgressions or 4?
Yeah, I think it's more than just the most recent generation with the nations that He's condemning. How many hundreds of years, I wouldn't be prepared to say. I do think, though, that when you look at the general timescale in the history, which hopefully we can do a little bit next week, Israel is born with more than the surrounding nations are because they are God's chosen people. And it is significant. Again, we talked about this, actually I think it was a conversation that happened after the fact, when you talk about the sort of northern kingdom, most of the initial writing prophets are sent to Israel, not to Judah. Israel's the one that goes into captivity first. Judah goes into captivity later. So there's a sense in which, I don't know if it's the crimes or the timeline is counting down faster on Israel than it is on Judah. Chuck.
I would caution about using the word captivity for Israel,
Okay.
because they were actually scattered.
Right. They were dispersed. Yeah.
You've got to keep in mind that as with the other nations, Israel was completely dispersed.
Yeah.
They were not, as opposed to Judah, which was all 12 tribes were represented in the captivity. Israel wasn't taken captive, it was scattered.
That's a good point, and I appreciate that, because that's one of the things I wanted to say as we go in here, and we're going to need to close soon. But I think one of the consistent threads that you can pull out among these indictments, including Israel's, is the word used here. Your translations may say trespass, it may say sin. Those are reasonable translations. The sense in here is literally war crimes, crimes against humanity. It doesn't translate poetically, but that's the sense that you're getting out of Amos, is you're committing crimes against humankind, against God's creation, effectively. And one of the things that I think you see consistently in the indictments is you weren't just doing warfare against the people, you were attempting to wipe them out. You look at one of the indictments here, and it's very graphic, it's horrible, and that's part of the point, but he says, against the sons of Ammon, because they ripped open the pregnant women of Gilead in order to what? In order to enlarge their borders. The idea here is not only is he assaulting the people, he's making sure they don't have any descendants to occupy that land. That their generations will cease, and that land is ours, because the people on it can't lay claim to it anymore if they don't exist. That's what he's getting at here, is you're attempting to remove them from the face of the earth so that they cease to exist. And he is going, in the end, to basically do that to the kingdom of Israel. Scatter it among the nations. Whereas Judah not only will have a remnant left, even in the midst of the exile, there are a handful of people that remain, but they will also return to it. So when we talk about, it's going to be all the way at the end in chapter 9, but there is that element of the Davidic return and the hope that remains at the end of the day. But it comes down to this, you're trying to remove people from the face of the earth. And I think, to briefly answer the question, and we'll probably come back to it next week, the difference between the indictment that God is throwing at them and what you see in the promised land conquest is God was saying the people in the promised land have got to go. They've got to be removed from the earth. Their time is up. And what you're finding with all of these nations is they're saying, well, we've decided. We, the nation, have decided that those people are gone. We're going to get rid of them. It's not a command from God saying their wickedness is complete, their line has ended. It's their own volition that's doing these things. And we're going to come back to this element of the role of the prophet in the face of the king, effectively, because as you move into this time frame, and we're seeing it a little bit from Aaron's study in Deuteronomy, Moses' prophetic discussion. When you get the kings, you start to get more prophets. The prophets are there effectively to rein in the excesses of the kings, usually. But also, when God relinquishes, when God says, okay, you guys can have a king over you, that king becomes the one who's making the decisions for Israel. Before, you had an out-and-out theocracy in which God was saying, here's what you do, here's where you go, here's how this happens. Then the king takes on that role. And one of the things that's happening in these indictments is he's saying, you have the authority over the nation, and you're steering it exactly opposite to the way that I have told you to. Are there any other questions before we close this morning? I have to pick up the thread next time, but
just a cross-reference from Deuteronomy, this from Deuteronomy 32. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God. But Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage.
yeah, I appreciate that. So we're going to come back to not as much of the geography, but dig in a little more to the transgressions and the time frame here next week. But let's close in a word of prayer. Father, we do thank you for this word. We thank you for just how much you have embedded of yourself in here. I find myself often guilty of not digging deep enough, not searching out enough, but your majesty and the awesomeness of how you have put so much information into such a small space about yourself, about your will, about your ways, never ceases to amaze, Father. So we thank you for your wisdom, for your entrusting these things to remain even to our day, recorded for us, for our information, for our edification. We ask that you would help us as we seek to read, to study, to enlarge our understanding, that you would bless it and that you would prosper it. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.